You've seen the movies. Knights charge into battle, stomachs full and hearts brave. But want to know the real reason most medieval armies never even made it to the battlefield? Forget swords and armor. The true fight was against hunger. What did it actually take to feed thousands of soldiers when running out of bread could mean losing a war? The answers might change everything you think you know about medieval warfare. Think medieval armies just wandered through the countryside, picking apples off trees and roasting wild boar over friendly campfires whenever they got hungry? That's what you see in movies. The glamorous version, where every march feels like a traveling picnic, and there's always another fat pig to be found behind someone's cottage. But real campaign life was a lot less Robin Hood and much more survival reality show. The classic image is all shining armor, hearty laughter, and baskets of apples, just ready to be plucked. Everyday meals seem to fall from the sky, conveniently appearing wherever a knight stretches his legs. You picture soldiers snacking on fresh bread, washing it down with cool water from babbling brooks, and banquets popping up at the end of the day like magic. The truth, though, makes that fantasy look about as realistic as a dragon sighting. Here's where things start to fall apart for that storybook army. Most of medieval Europe wasn't filled with overflowing orchards, or wild game running around waiting to become dinner. Even if you happened to stumble into an orchard, it probably belonged to somebody, and thousands of hungry soldiers descending on it would clear it out in minutes. Now imagine those same soldiers moving through fields and villages, grabbing anything not nailed down: grain, chickens, vegetables, even a goat or two. Armies didn't wander in for a polite harvest. They devoured everything in sight. This wasn't just bad news for the next meal, it was a disaster for the locals too. Villages stripped bare of their crops, and animals faced famine for months, or even years after an army passed through. Let's really put this into perspective. Take a football stadium and fill it with fans, anywhere from 20,000 to 50,000 screaming people. Now imagine trying to feed all those folks for even a single day, just using backyard gardens, a few village wells, and somebody's flock of chickens. You'd run out of food in less time than it takes to play a halftime show. A typical rural landscape, with scattered farms and small communities, couldn't handle the appetite of an army, even for a weekend. The first day, maybe a few men would stuff themselves with whatever they could find. By day 2, cupboards would be empty, pigs gone, wells muddy, and not even a moldy turnip left. The army would still be hungry. There's actual evidence of this. 2. Not just stories from chroniclers who like to exaggerate. Archaeologists have found layers of destruction along famous campaign routes. The medieval version of trash left behind at a festival, except instead of candy wrappers, it's signs of burned fields, churned up earth, and smashed food stores. You'd think an army would leave behind loot, but what's left is usually devastation and emptiness. Many campaign trails became virtual wastelands in their wake, a far cry from those movie feasts. Farmers and villagers often had to abandon their homes, and it wasn't just irritating. It could cause outright starvation. Recent studies back this up with some cold hard math. Historians have dug into records and found that the idea of living off the land pretty much belongs in medieval fantasy novels, not real campaigns. For most military expeditions that lasted more than a few days, foraging only worked under rare, perfect conditions, like moving through totally untouched land with small numbers. If you sent a large army out with empty wagons, counting on random luck and wild berries, you were asking for trouble. The self-feeding army was a myth built on desperation more than actual planning. Hunger forced soldiers to take food wherever they could find it, but there just wasn't nearly enough to go around, even in the most bountiful years. This is where medieval warfare reveals its harsh underbelly. Armies didn't march as independent packs of merry scavengers, without a serious plan to bring food with them, or constant resupplies from friendly towns and depots. Soldiers went hungry, morale collapsed, and entire campaigns failed before a single arrow was loosed. Medieval commanders quickly learned they needed something resembling a basic supply chain, even if it was slow, clunky, and sometimes downright chaotic. Food wasn't just another worry. Either, it was the one problem that could end a campaign instantly. No amount of bravery on the field could make a soldier fight better after a week of eating boiled weeds or nothing at all. And the higher up the army ladder you were, the more you complained if dinner didn't arrive on time. The fantasy of endless feasts and easy roadside banquets? That's busted. The real enemy lurking behind almost every medieval campaign wasn't a rival king or an army of mercenaries. It was plain old hunger, gnawing away at discipline and strength with every empty pot. And instead of raging at the gates, most soldiers feared empty bellies long before they ever saw an enemy's banner. So, if picking apples and chasing chickens didn't cut it, you're probably wondering, how did anyone manage to feed an army on the move at all? Try to picture a city on the move. Not a handful of knights and their squires, but tens of thousands of people shuffling along muddy roads every day. No corner stores, no food trucks, and definitely no late-night drive-through snacks. Feeding this traveling mob was the real nightmare for medieval commanders. This wasn't just about keeping warriors happy. It was about keeping the entire army, including their horses, squires, smiths, cooks, and random hangers-on, alive and moving. The numbers alone are enough to make your eyes water. A typical army could suck up hundreds of tons of food and drink every day. Just think, an army as large as 60,000 men, with their horses and helpers, needed well over 100 tons of bread, grain, and ale every single day to not collapse from pure exhaustion. Horses alone ate mountains of hay and oats. And this human and horse freight train also trailed along camp followers. Wives, children, merchants, smiths, medics, and cooks. Everyone needed a piece of the daily bread. But the real magic, or maybe just pure madness, started with logistics. Every mouthful had to be thought through and planned out. Picture having to source every single loaf of bread or sack of oats for an entire city. Only you don't have telephones, email, or GPS. If one single link in the food chain snapped, the whole system could break down in days. Forget to organize water one morning, you might have hundreds of men collapsing by midday, miss a batch of grain or run out of beer, and you'd have more than just complaints. You could lose discipline, morale, and pretty soon, an actual fight. Army life wasn't about glamorous sword fights. It was more about surviving the daily dinner scramble. Quartermasters were supposed to handle all this. If you think your job is stressful, spare a moment for these medieval logistics wizards. Each one had an impossible task. Track every ration, chase down merchants who liked to suddenly disappear, and force reluctant peasants to hand over their food. Since medieval armies liked their paperwork about as much as rain at a picnic, planning meant a lot of shouting, running, and pure guesswork. A quartermaster's life was an endless cycle of panic, angry soldiers, and last-minute improvisation. If you're wondering where this food actually came from, the answer is anywhere necessary. Armies would buy, tax, confiscate, or just grab whatever they needed. Sometimes commanders sent out contractors to buy food from local markets or towns. Other times, it was less polite. Troops would demand supplies from terrified peasants. During bad times, whole villages lost their harvest in a single night, emptied out by troops hungry and desperate to keep moving. The paperwork rarely matched the reality. Sometimes merchants promised barrels of ale and delivered watered-down leftovers. Sometimes supplies just vanished, right along with the seller. And even if you could find the food, getting it to the hungry soldiers was another challenge. Medieval wagons were the opposite of reliable. Wheels cracked, axles snapped, and if you were lucky, you'd only lose the day's bread to a muddy ditch instead of watching the whole cart sink out of sight. Roads weren't roads so much as stretches of churned mud, full of ruts that could eat a donkey whole. Rain turned supply lines into clogged waiting rooms. Blazing sun meant bread spoiled and fresh food became just another tempting meal for insects. And if the roads or wagons didn't get you, the enemy just might. Sabotaging or raiding supply trains was a favorite pastime, sometimes requiring huge groups of guards to keep one sad little bakery wagon safe. It wasn't just fighting against roads and weather, either. Anytime you stretched supply lines over enemy territory, or even unfriendly land, every meal was at risk. Armies spent as much time worrying about their next loaf of bread as they did about the enemy's archers. If anything went wrong, that whole moving city could stall out in a matter of days. Hunger crept in fast, and chaos soon followed. The famous march to Agincourt in 1415 is a perfect example. The French had more soldiers than the English, but their supply lines were a disaster. They trudged toward the enemy for days, bellies empty and tempers short. By the time they finally faced the English army, their real opponent wasn't men with longbows. It was their own hunger. You could see it in the way they fought, poorly, sluggishly, and with little nerve. Supplying an army in the Middle Ages wasn't a tiny errand on the side. Think of it as the main boss battle of every campaign. If you failed to keep the food coming, you'd never even get a chance to see the enemy's face. Move an entire city on foot, hand out breakfast, protect every cart of grain like it's royal treasure. That's what commanders faced every day. Most victories happen not because of some flashy sword move, but because someone somewhere managed to keep the bread and beer coming for just a few days longer. All that agony over bread and beans raises a good question. Once all that food did reach the camp, what ended up in a medieval soldier's lunchbox? Let's look at what these well-traveled, often disappointed stomachs actually got to eat. If you're picturing medieval soldiers biting into roast beef and washing it down with goblets of wine, time for a reality check. The average menu was built around survival, not comfort. Taste was a happy accident if it happened at all. Think more hardtack, hard cheese, barley mush, dried peas, beans, and a mug of ale that was more about killing germs than celebration. Let's talk about those staples. Hardtack was this rock-hard bread that could break your teeth before it went stale. It lasted forever, which was the only thing going for it. Soldiers would sometimes soak it in water or ale until it got mushy enough to chew. Hard cheese was another standard, tough, dense, and salty, nowhere near what you'd want on a lazy Sunday picnic. Barley mush, basically a hot, sticky porridge made of boiled grain and maybe a bit of animal fat, made up most breakfasts. Dried legumes were the shapeshifters of medieval nutrition. Lentils, beans, and peas that stayed good for months in a sack and could transform into a filling, if dull, meal in a big cauldron. You're not eating for flavor. You're eating to stay moving. What about meat? Forget it. Unless you were lucky, rich, or found yourself next to a freshly killed goat. Preserved meat was a big prize, usually salted or smoked to keep it from going bad, so every bite tasted more like a salt lick than ham on the bone. Most soldiers knew they'd be powering through pots of beans and barley instead, with the dream of fresh meat saved for the once-in-a-lifetime moments. If you got blood sausage or salted pork in your bowl, you didn't complain. You counted yourself blessed. More often, meals meant beans, more beans, and something vaguely meat-adjacent if the stars aligned. For soldiers who wanted a little excitement on their spoon, there were foods that tested the limits of stomachs and bravery. Garlic onion paste was a crowd favorite. Imagine a sticky medieval energy gel that promised flavor, immune support, and maybe a little regret at first whiff. The army actually rationed out garlic. Knights got 6 cloves, regular foot soldiers got 3, keeping both germs and probably fellow soldiers at bay. This stuff doubled as medicine and a vitamin C booster, courtesy of onions, which was important if you didn't want to drop dead from scurvy before facing the enemy. Blood porridge, on the other hand, was not for the faint of heart. This was porridge laced with fresh animal blood, usually spiced up to help you forget what you were eating. As gross as it sounds, it was packed with protein, iron, and just about every B vitamin you could want. Leave it to hungry soldiers to invent survival foods that double as a test of courage. Then there were pickled turnips and fermented cabbage. Yes, the medieval version of sauerkraut. These were lifesavers in the winter when nothing grew. The pickling process kept vitamin C in the mix, helping soldiers avoid scurvy and making armies last a little longer when the going got tough. Food wasn't designed for dinner parties. It was about speed. Barley mush was made so soft and gooey you could slurp it without slowing down, sort of like instant noodles, but without any of the fun flavors. Everything needed to travel, survive rainstorms, and feed a crowd without turning into moldy mush after a few days. Soldiers didn't care much about how things tasted. If it gave you enough calories to keep walking or swinging a sword, you ate it. Of course, not everyone in the camp got the same deal. Knights, who sat higher up the food chain, could expect extras. Sometimes honey cakes packed with nuts, a rare pre-battle boost crammed with calories, or double garlic rations for health. A regular archer or footman would make do with smaller rations and the basics, whatever filled the belly fastest. Morale sometimes depended on who got the best deal at mealtime, and there was no hiding what was in your bowl. And drinking water? Only if you had a taste for danger. Water left you rolling the dice on every sip, dysentery, cholera, and even just plain stinky swamp taste. Ale was the army's version of Gatorade, minus the artificial flavors. Mildly alcoholic and full of calories, it was safer than water, good for a refill, and even helped calm the nerves before battle. If you want a taste of just how carefully these rations were measured, there's a record from the English army in 1386. It shows 40 pounds of hard cheese, feeding 100 men for 2 days. Try dividing that up, it comes out to a little bit each day, and you'll notice there was no room for seconds. So the secret sauce to medieval stamina wasn't a well-roasted pig, but the power of unyielding, storable calories. All those beans, mushes, and hard loaves held empires together, one bland, gritty meal at a time. But here's where things get even messier. Getting all that food to the front wasn't even the hard part. Things really turned chaotic when the supply lines started breaking down. Everyone loves to talk about sword fights, catapults, and that one shiny knight who wins the day, but let's be honest, the sneakiest, most effective trick in medieval warfare wasn't sticking your enemy with a pointy bit of metal. The real game changer was starving your enemy so badly they either ran away or handed over the castle keys without anyone swinging a sword. Food lines weren't just important, they were the army's literal lifeline. Cut them off, and the toughest army in Europe could turn into a mob of starving, useless skeletons in under a week. All those grand speeches about chivalry and courage mean almost nothing next to a week with nothing to eat but hope. Every commander knew it. That's why taking out supply lines was the move everyone wanted to pull off. Raiding, sneaking behind lines, torching a wagon full of barley. All classic tactics that could tip the scales in a matter of hours. Just one broken wagon didn't mean some knight skipped lunch. It meant thousands of hungry men, hundreds of nervous horses, and maybe a camp full of sick or angry people. No supply, no army. Serious commanders lost more sleep over keeping their food wagons rolling than about who wore the fanciest plume in his helmet. In a siege, the food fight was the real fight. The walls and battlements, just the sideshow to a much grittier battle rumbling in everyone's stomach. The supply line itself was like a slow-motion parade begging for disaster. Medieval wagons moved just a few painful miles a day, trundling along with squeaky wheels and drivers swearing at every rut in the road. Picture a line of creaky wooden carts, mules dragging sacks of flour, and half-asleep guards wandering beside them, hoping they wouldn't be jumped by bandits or enemy raiders. Guards tried their best, but spend a few weeks in the rain or mud and morale drops lower than the soup pot. Add some bad weather and the roads turn into pits of quicksand. Even a little rain could make carts tip or get stuck. Hungry, frightened soldiers trying to force a wagon through knee-deep mud is not a moment from an epic story. It's what made or broke entire campaigns. Power plays in medieval war didn't need swords or armor, just clever sabotage. Blow up a bridge ahead of a supply train, and you'd see soldiers scraping crumbs off the floor by sunset. Sometimes an army burned fields, destroyed wells, or just plain blocked every road into town. The whole job was to starve whoever was stuck inside, making them so desperate they'd surrender for a slice of bread. Defenders didn't sit around, either. Desperate to hold off attackers, they risked everything to run underground tunnels, called saps, under walls to smuggle food into the hungry crowd. Imagine sneaking cheese through a dirt tunnel with enemy scouts waiting above you, listening for a shovel scraping stone. If you got caught, you lost the food and probably a few brave volunteers. The danger was constant, and so was the creativity. In the 12th century siege of Tyre, it got so wild that the defenders actually threw a feast for the attackers, hoping the promise of a party would distract them. It worked. The attackers let down their guard and had to pack up and leave, all because of a little food trickery. For everyone else stuck behind the walls, food was as precious as gold. Wine and beer weren't just for celebration. Commanders gave them out for medicinal purposes, which, let's face it, helped soften the pain of stale bread and hunger. At Orleans in 1429, the French and English didn't just shoot arrows at each other. They sent out raiding parties every night, trying to grab or destroy each other's food wagons. The siege was as much about burning supplies as breaking walls. Hunger wore down armies fast. Soldiers watched rations shrink day by day until the only thing left standing was their anger. Discipline fell apart. Some deserted when they couldn't take it. Others mutinied. It didn't take much for that line between holding the wall and running for the hills to snap. The physical toll was just as bad. Malnutrition was the start. Less food meant weaker soldiers. Weakness meant sickness invited itself into camp. Diseases like dysentery, typhus, and plain old scurvy swept through hungry camps like wildfire. One man gets sick, then the tent next to him, then the whole unit, and soldiers start dying off before the first swords clash. No battles, no heroics, just empty beds and half rations for the ones still moving. If you want the modern version, picture your favorite team finally getting to the playoffs, then finding out they ran out of food on the bus and can't even walk onto the field. That's what happened to armies who lost at logistics. Pretty soon, nobody cared about banners or honor. They just wanted a crust of bread, and maybe to go home alive. So, the real winner in plenty of those legendary battles wasn't the flash of steel or the brilliance of a general. It was the side that could keep soldiers eating one more day than their opponent. Want to know how armies tried to outsmart hunger when everything was on the line? Well, that's where the unsung geniuses on the supply team come in, and they had to get even more creative when the stakes couldn't be higher. Think knights with shining swords were the real stars of a medieval war? Guess again. The field belonged to people you almost never hear about, the quartermasters and supply officers, those behind-the-scenes miracle workers who stopped armies from having to eat the local weeds. These logistical masterminds were juggling more problems than a modern event planner thrust into the middle of a mud pit, just with a lot more yelling and far fewer thank you notes. Nobody made epic poems about them, but they were the ones standing between thousands of hungry mouths and complete disaster. Let's talk about preparation. Most of us struggle to plan dinner for 6 on short notice. These folks had to map out food for tens of thousands months ahead, with no weather app, no spreadsheets, and an army that kept moving. Everything from how much flour to bring, to which towns might have spare pigs next season, was up to them. Their job wasn't just to load carts and march out. It involved coaxing and negotiating with stubborn towns, hiring and firing merchants, and, when all else failed, flat-out improvising. If you want a picture, just imagine someone trying to keep both the soldiers and the locals from rioting, while fending off angry bakers, desperate peasants, and suspicious nobles. Armies didn't just lean on luck, and they definitely didn't leave things up to charity. Formal contracts with merchants were pretty standard whenever possible. Someone official to buy up barrels of beer and sacks of grain before the army marched in. Deals were struck for everything. Wheat barrels, even the right to use a local oven. But if the polite approach didn't work, they'd just take what they needed. Forced requisition was basically the medieval version of "we'll take that, thanks," leaving locals with empty pantries and plenty of resentment. On a rough campaign, entire harvests could vanish in a day, and the army kept moving, leaving all the blame behind. Every time this happened, quartermasters became the face of both hope and dread for local villagers. Would they pay fairly? Would they just take everything and leave nothing behind but empty barns and worry lines? You might think the solution was simple. Just bring more food. But without modern packaging, food spoiled fast. That's where some clever medieval workarounds made a difference. Enter the mobile bakery and field brewery. You wouldn't believe it, but medieval armies, sometimes, brought along wagons turned into rolling ovens or portable beer makers. With mobile bakeries, fresh bread could be made at the camp, saving the day whenever biscuit supplies ran out. The same goes for field breweries. Nothing was more likely to keep soldiers happy and hydrated than a steady trickle of mild ale. These inventions didn't just boost energy, they kept bellies full even when the supply lines lagged miles behind. The idea of moving kitchens rolling alongside your marching soldiers is proof of just how inventive these people had to be. Preserved foods were another secret weapon. Medieval commanders knew that fresh fish or pork didn't last the week, even less so on a summer march. Quartermasters loaded up on anything that could survive months of jostling in a sack: hard cheese, dried beans, salt pork, tough sausages, and flatbread hard enough to survive being dropped from a horse. Some even prepared rations ahead of time, salted and smoked, so they could last the campaign. Preserved supplies weren't glamorous, but they worked. Boosting morale wasn't just about calories. Some commanders brought along a bit of theater. Food could be blessed by priests before a big fight, believed to bring luck or courage. You also find stories of honey cakes passed around before battle, offering a blast of sugar and a psychological boost. Honey cakes became the original energy bar, packed with nuts, honey, and whatever else the kitchen could spare, saving the day when nerves sagged and energy dipped. Alcohol got its own medical stamp of approval. Beer and wine were part medicine, part comfort, officially handed out in some armies to settle nerves before a charge or ease the pain of wounds and losses. Making the food last required a mix of tight organization and a little hope. Quartermasters counted every loaf and chunk of cheese, portioning it all out using some of the strictest ration systems seen before modern times. Rationing kept everyone from wolfing through everything in the first week. If you ate more than your share, you risked punishment that went way beyond just angry glares. Every crumb counted, and some days, dividing up stale bread turned into its own kind of battlefield. Real success stories in medieval warfare often had less to do with generals making heroic speeches and more with the logistics team quietly working miracles. The English victory at Crécy is a prime example. While the French army stumbled along, supply trains starved and desertions rampant, the English managed to keep their troops reasonably fed. That edge, plain, simple food, did more for the cause than almost any single sword. So, behind every famous victory, there's a small army of supply experts, inventors, and patient organizers who made sure the only grass eaten in camp was by the horses. Next time someone starts talking about knights and castles, remember that the real action was just as likely to be in the mess tent as it was on the open field. Even the bravest soldier can't fight with an empty stomach, and often, whoever kept their camp fed the longest took home the victory banner. Next time you hear some story about knights winning with pure grit, remember, the First Crusade's biggest weapon wasn't just steel, but sacks of bread. Victory frequently began with securing provisions. When hungry armies quit before the archers even stretched their bows, it all came down to the quartermasters, bakers, and wagon drivers. In strategy games, winning a battle is hard, but keeping troops fed, that's the real magic trick. So, which medieval supply officer deserves a shout out? Drop your favorite in the comments. If behind-the-scenes heroes are your thing, stick around. There's a lot more hidden history on the menu.